On an August afternoon in 1945, inside a chandelier-lit mansion in Moscow, the United States ambassador accepted a carved wooden gift from a group of Soviet school children and unknowingly hung a live microphone on his wall. It didn't need batteries. It didn't need wires. For 7 years, it sat there like a patriotic decoration, quietly turning the private words of American diplomats into Soviet intelligence. If that sounds like a spy thriller plot twist, it's because the real version is somehow stranger. The building was Spaso House, the U.S. ambassador's residence, tucked behind walls and trees not far from the garden ring. It was the kind of place designed to make power feel permanent. Heavy doors, polished floors, tall windows that trapped summer light and winter gloom in equal measure. The Second World War had just ended in Europe. Japan had not yet surrendered. Moscow was celebrating victory and counting its dead at the same time, a city full of uniforms and ration queues and enormous, scarred pride. The alliance between Washington and Moscow was still technically intact, but it was already hardening into something colder, more suspicious. The diplomats living at Spaso House could feel it in the texture of daily life, the drivers who always seemed to be listening, the servants who were never quite just servants, the sense that every telephone line and every room had invisible company. And yet, on the 4th August 1945, the scene looked disarmingly wholesome. Soviet young pioneers, children in uniform, symbols of the state's future, arrived with a ceremonial present for Ambassador W. Averell Harriman. They handed him a large wooden plaque carved with the Great Seal of the United States, the American eagle rendered in relief with a craftsman's attention to feathers and arrows, and the shield. Gifts like this were normal in diplomacy, especially in that theatrical Soviet style that mixed genuine pride with carefully staged messaging. Harriman, a hard-nosed businessman and Roosevelt's seasoned envoy, knew Moscow played games. He also knew how to smile through them. The plaque went up on a wall in Spaso House, where it looked, to any visitor, like a polite token of wartime friendship. The trick was that it was also a listening device. Not a crude one either, not a wired microphone jammed behind plaster that a competent sweep might find. This was a piece of applied physics so elegant that even American technicians later struggled to understand how it had hidden in plain sight for years. It had no internal power source. It was passive, meaning it didn't emit a telltale signal unless it was activated from outside. For a long stretch of the early Cold War, it sat within arm's reach of American decision-makers and gave Soviet counterintelligence something it craved even more than codes and ciphers: real voices in real rooms, speaking with the careless confidence that comes from believing a space is private. To understand why this operation is so bizarre, you have to step back into the Soviet security apparatus that made it possible, and into the peculiar life of the man who built the device. By 1945, Soviet state security had already gone through multiple institutional forms: Cheka, GPU, OGPU, NKVD, NKGB, names shifting as Stalin shuffled power and purged rivals. But the core logic remained steady. The Soviet leadership believed, with reason and paranoia in equal measure, that it was surrounded by enemies. Intelligence was not just a tool. It was a survival mechanism for a regime that saw conspiracy as the default state of politics. The Soviet services didn't simply collect secrets. They shaped realities, cultivated deception as an art form, and treated technology as another battlefield. Embassy surveillance was central to that. In Moscow, foreign missions were assumed to be nests of espionage, and the Soviet state had near total control over what those missions could buy, who could work for them, and how their buildings were maintained. That control created opportunities. The staff at Spaso House could try to enforce American security protocols, but they were operating on Soviet territory, surrounded by a police state that had perfected the craft of invisibility. A guard who looked bored could be trained. A carpenter could be an informant. A building renovation could be a penetration. From the Soviet point of view, the ambassador's residence was not merely a diplomatic location. It was a high-value intelligence target, a place where policy became personal, where visiting officials relaxed, where off-the-record conversations happened over brandy, where unguarded remarks surfaced because people believed they were among friends. The KGB as an institution would not formally exist until 1954, when it was created after Stalin's death and the reorganization of security structures that followed. But the lineage is direct. The people who ran Soviet technical espionage in 1945 worked under agencies that were ancestors of the KGB, and the mindset, methods, and personnel networks carried over. When later generations spoke of KGB tricks, they were often inheriting techniques developed in the NKGB and MGB era, when Stalin's state security machine was both ruthless and lavishly resourced. Now for the man at the heart of the device, Lev Sergeyevich Termen, better known in the West as Leon Therina. His name is famous in music history for the therina, the eerie electronic instrument played without physical contact, invented in the early 1920s. But Termina's story is also a Soviet intelligence story, and the overlap is part of what makes the Great Seal operation feel unreal. In the late 1920s and 1930s, Termina lived in the United States, demonstrating his instrument, moving through a world of concerts and laboratories and wealthy patrons. Then, in 1938, he returned to the Soviet Union under murky circumstances. Accounts differ on whether he left voluntarily under pressure or was effectively coerced. What is documented is that he was arrested soon after, swept into the Stalinist system of repression. Like many technically gifted prisoners, he ended up in a sharashka, a secret research facility where imprisoned scientists and engineers worked on state projects under guard. This was one of the Soviet Union's strangest contradictions, a regime that destroyed lives with arbitrary terror and then exploited the minds of the people it had broken. In those laboratories, creativity became a form of captivity. Semin, an inventor with a flair for the unseen and intangible, was set to work on technical surveillance devices. The Soviet services needed new ways to listen. Traditional microphones required power and wiring and maintenance. In a hostile environment like an embassy, those vulnerabilities could get an operation blown. A truly stealthy bug had to be quiet not only acoustically, but electrically. Somewhere in that blend of physics and necessity, Themin helped create what would later be known in U.S. counterintelligence circles as the Thing. The Americans would eventually learn the device's basic principle. It was a resonant cavity microphone activated by radio waves from an external transmitter. Imagine a tiny metal chamber with a thin membrane. Sound in the room, human voices, footsteps, the scrape of a chair caused that membrane to vibrate. Those vibrations altered the properties of a radio signal bouncing inside a cavity. When Soviet operators illuminated it with a radio frequency beam from outside, the device reflected a modulated signal back, carrying the room's audio like a ghost riding on a carrier wave. Because the device had no internal power supply, it could sit dormant, impossible to detect with a kind of sweeps designed to find active transmitters. That last point mattered enormously. In the world of espionage, detection often depends on emissions. Something electrical leaking into the environment, some signature a scanner can catch. A passive device is like a mine that doesn't tick. You can walk past it for years. You can even search for it, and if you're searching the wrong way, you'll find nothing. The brilliance and the menace of the Great Seal bug was that it weaponized the physics of reflection. It didn't need to speak unless spoken to. From the Soviet perspective, embedding such a device inside a diplomatic gift was more than clever. It was ideologically satisfying. The Great Seal of the United States, an American symbol, would become a Soviet tool. The object that said we respect your nation would in practice say we own your privacy. It was also operationally practical. A gift is carried inside openly. It is mounted proudly. It is defended emotionally. People don't like to believe a friendly gesture was a weapon, and because the plaque was large and solid, it provided space to conceal a cavity and an antenna without looking suspicious. So the plaque went up in Spaso House. Days became months. The war ended fully. The alliance cracked. Churchill delivered his Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, warning that Soviet influence had fallen across Eastern Europe. The Truman Doctrine followed in 1947, promising US support for countries resisting communism. The Marshall Plan began rebuilding Western Europe with American money, which Moscow saw as economic warfare. In 1948, the Berlin blockade and airlift turned the divided city into a global symbol of confrontation. In 1949, NATO was formed, and the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb. The Cold War wasn't declared with a single announcement. It thickened like ice, spreading through every relationship until normal movement became impossible. Through all of that, inside Spaso House, American diplomats talked. They talked about Berlin, about Poland, about reparations and refugees, about the politics of the Kremlin's inner circle. They talked about their impressions of Soviet officials and what was rumor and what was real. They talked about what Washington wanted and what Washington feared. And, for at least part of those conversations, the Soviet security services were listening, in the same way a person listens through a wall, not always catching every word, but often catching enough to understand the shape of a thought. The human element here is what makes the operation so chilling. It's one thing to imagine intercepted cables and decrypted telegrams, information moving in official channels, already filtered and formal. It's another to picture an ambassador leaning back in a chair, exhaling after a tense meeting, speaking candidly to a trusted aide. The Soviet services did not just want to know what the Americans were doing, they wanted to know what the Americans were like in private. Who sounded confident? Who sounded exhausted? Who sounded divided from their colleagues? In intelligence, tone can be as valuable as content. A microphone in the room captures tone. At some point after Harriman's tenure, he served as ambassador to the Soviet Union. From late 1943 to early 1946, Spaso House saw other ambassadors, other staffs. The Great Seal remained. It did not look like an intrusion. It looked like decoration. It was a trophy of diplomacy, a reminder of the wartime alliance that had defeated Nazi Germany at unimaginable cost. That is another irony. The plaque arrived at a moment when cooperation still existed, and it continued to function as the relationship turned hostile. A symbol from the last war moment became a tool for the coldest years. The operation required more than the device. The Soviets had to be able to illuminate it with radio waves and capture the reflected audio-modulated signal. That meant positioning technical equipment within range, likely in nearby buildings and through line of sight or near enough to reach the target room with sufficient power. Moscow was an environment where the state controlled surrounding real estate, and it was not difficult for the security services to use adjacent spaces for surveillance. From the Americans' point of view, Spaso House was theirs, but the city around it belonged to the Soviet system. The wall around the residence provided privacy from the street, but it could not stop physics. What did the Americans suspect? They suspected plenty. US diplomatic facilities in Moscow were notorious for being compromised. The very fact of living and working there meant accepting that security was a constant struggle. But suspicion is not the same as proof, and proof is not the same as finding the needle. Security sweeps in that era relied heavily on detecting radio transmitters, unusual wiring, or physical anomalies. A passive device that only came alive when irradiated from outside was a different category of threat. It exploited a gap between what people feared and what they knew to search for. And it exploited something else, the psychology of normalcy. People adapt. If you are a diplomat in Moscow and you assume everything is bugged, you either become paralyzed or you learn to function anyway. You tell yourself you'll be careful. You keep certain conversations outdoors. You speak in generalities. Then over time, you forget. Not completely, but enough. enough to speak freely when tired, when angry, when trying to persuade someone, when believing the room is safe because it looks safe. Years passed. In 1952, a moment arrived that felt, to those involved, like the sudden lifting of a curtain. Accounts of the exact chain of discovery vary in the details, but the core fact is documented. The Great Seal plaque was found to contain a listening device in 1952, after it had been hanging in the ambassador's residence for roughly 7 years. American personnel detected suspicious radioactivity and, through investigation, traced it back to the plaque. The shock was not only that a device was present, it was the type of device. When they examined it, they found something that didn't match the usual profile of a bug. There was no powered transmitter to disable. There was nothing continuously emitting. It was a silent mechanism until activated. That discovery changed the emotional weather inside the American mission. Imagine the feeling of walking into a room you've used for years, a room where decisions were made, where you tried to be careful but not paranoid, and realizing the walls were not just metaphorically thin. The betrayal is physical. It has a location. It was there the whole time, carved into an object you saw every day. The Great Seal, in a grimly literal sense, had been compromised. What did the Americans do with the device? They studied it, because a compromise is also an education. Understanding how it worked mattered for defending other facilities, not only in Moscow, but worldwide. If the Soviets could deploy a passive resonant cavity microphone, then traditional countermeasures were not enough. The Cold War was, in part, a contest between offense and defense in invisible domain signals, electronics, tradecraft, where each breakthrough forced a recalibration. One side invents a lock, the other invents a pick, then someone invents a lock that looks like a war ornament. The story did not end in quiet embarrassment. In May 1960, the Cold War suffered one of its most public ruptures, the U-2 incident. An American U-2 spy plane piloted by France's Gary Powers was shot down over the Soviet Union on 1st May 1960. Washington initially attempted to cover the mission with a false story about a weather research aircraft, but Moscow had Powers alive and wreckage to display. The diplomatic fallout was immediate. A planned summit in Paris between Eisenhower and Khrushchev collapsed in recriminations. In that atmosphere, espionage was not merely practiced, it was performed. Later that month at the United Nations, U.S. Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. used the Great Seal device as a prop in the theater of accusation and counter-accusation. He displayed the listening device to the UN Security Council as evidence of Soviet eavesdropping, turning a hidden operation into a public exhibit. The irony stacked on itself, a secret Soviet triumph, discovered and then repurposed as American proof of Soviet duplicity, shown in response to Soviet outrage over American aerial spying. Each side insisted the other was uniquely immoral. Each side had its own catalogue of intrusions. The device itself was a kind of symbol of the era's intelligence culture. It revealed a Soviet emphasis on technical ingenuity and patient operations. It also revealed something about American assumptions. The Americans were not naive about Moscow, but they were still startled by the sophistication of what had been done to them. If a wooden plaque could hide a microphone that functioned without power, then what else could be hidden? If the compromise was that deep, what did it mean for every memo written in that building, every negotiation discussed before it happened? The operational success of the Great Seal bug also depended on Soviet discipline. A device like this is not a one-time win. It requires control, timing, and exploitation. The operators had to know when high-value conversations were likely to occur, when to activate the illumination transmitter, when to record, and how to interpret what they heard. Embassy life has rhythms, meetings, receptions, late-night calls after cables arrive from Washington. The Soviets, watching Spaso House and its occupants constantly, could choose their moments. The device didn't force them to listen all the time. It gave them the option to listen at exactly the times that mattered. And behind that discipline was a broader Soviet system of surveillance and counterintelligence that treated foreigners as targets by default. Moscow in the late Stalin period was saturated with control. Foreign diplomats were followed, their contacts were noted. Soviet citizens who interacted with them were taking risks that could ruin their lives. Buildings were penetrated not only by bugs but by informants and by architectural manipulation. Even the mundane infrastructure, telephones, repairs, deliveries, was part of the state's advantage. The Great Seal bug stands out because it was ingenious, but it was also part of an ecosystem of intrusion where the state's power over the physical environment made technical tricks easier to deploy and harder to prevent. There is another layer of human drama when you remember the device's inventor. The Raman who helped shape this technology did not live the life of a triumphant engineer in a free laboratory. He moved through the Soviet century like a figure caught between genius and captivity, celebrated and punished by the same system. He had been honored for invention, then arrested, then forced to invent for the state from behind walls. His work served an intelligence apparatus that would reward him with survival and recognition, but was built on fear. That paradox, brilliance extracted through coercion, was one of the Soviet state's defining features. When people say it sounds made up, part of what they mean is that the moral logic feels impossible. Yet it happened, documented in lives like his. What were the consequences of the Great Seal operation in practical terms? One consequence was technical. It pushed American counter-surveillance and facility security into new territory. If you cannot rely on detecting emissions, you need different methods. You need physical inspection, X-rays, material analysis, controlled environments, and the assumption that even inert-looking objects can be hostile hardware. Over time, Cold War security practice evolved toward more aggressive construction standards for secure rooms, better shielding, and more systematic sweeps that look for unusual resonance structures and passive components, not just powered transmitters. Another consequence was psychological and diplomatic. Discovering such a device reinforced the belief that negotiations with the Soviet Union took place in an atmosphere of permanent espionage. That belief did not create the Cold War, but it fed it. Trust was already scarce. Operations like this burned what little remained. They helped ensure that even when leaders talked about peaceful coexistence, their bureaucracies planned for betrayal. In that sense, the Great Seal was not only a bug, it was a tiny engine of suspicion, quietly doing what the Cold War itself did, turning communication into a weapon. It's also worth noting what the operation did not do. It did not magically give the Soviets every American secret. An audio bug captures what is said in the room it occupies when it is activated and when the people in it speak candidly. Diplomatic work is vast and much of it is written, encrypted, compartmented. The device was powerful but not omnipotent. Its value lay in select access to candid conversations and impressions information that can reveal intentions, internal disagreements, and the emotional state of decision makers. That kind of intelligence can shape strategy. It can help a negotiator anticipate pressure points. It can help a negotiator anticipate pressure points. It can help a security service identify which officials are influential and which are merely present. And perhaps the most unsettling part is how ordinary the beginning was. A gift, children, a ceremony. No dramatic break-in, no midnight drilling. The operation was designed to look like nothing at all. If you place the Great Seal bug alongside other documented Cold War intrusions, its weirdness becomes part of a pattern. The era produced operations that sound like fiction because they combined bureaucratic seriousness with improvisational audacity. The Soviets and Americans both invested enormous resources in technical intelligence, from wiretaps and hidden cameras to elaborate listening posts and code-breaking programs. The difference here is the elegance of the concealment. The Great Seal operation didn't merely hide a device, it hid the very category of device. It relied on the target searching for the wrong thing. In the long run, this logic has not disappeared. Modern espionage often works the same way. just with different materials. Today, a compromised object might not be a wooden plaque, but a router, a smartphone, a smart speaker, a firmware update, a supply chain component that looks legitimate and is even installed with pride because it represents modernity. The principle is constant. The most effective surveillance is the kind that feels normal, the kind that fits into your world so smoothly you stop seeing it as foreign. Spaso House still exists. The Cold War ended, at least in its 20th century form. The Soviet Union dissolved in December 1991 after years of economic strain, political reform attempts, and nationalist pressures that tore the Union apart. The KGB itself was broken up during that period, its functions split among successor agencies in the Russian Federation and other post-Soviet states. But the craft of intelligence survived every renaming, every reorganization, because it answered a perennial need felt by states: the desire to know what others are thinking and the fear of being the last to know. The Great Seal bug also leaves behind a lesson about how history actually works. We tend to imagine turning points as speeches, treaties, battles, dramatic photographs. Yet sometimes the shape of an era is captured in a small engineered cavity hidden behind carved wood. A room full of diplomats thinks it is discussing the fate of nations in private. Somewhere outside, unseen, an operator tunes a signal. The room's air vibrates with voices, a membrane quivers, a reflected radio wave changes almost imperceptibly, and a secret crosses a line it did not know existed. That is why this operation still grabs the imagination. Not because it is supernatural or mythical, but because it is so precisely human, ingenious, suspicious, and opportunistic. It reminds us that the world can be altered by the smallest unexamined assumption, like assuming a gift is only a gift. In a century defined by propaganda and paranoia, the most bizarre trick was also the simplest. Take a symbol your enemy trusts and make it listen.